I had a lunch with a psychologist friend of mine years ago, and I said, Jesus, this is terrible. Every time I talk about my grandfather, I lose it. I can't take it. I mean, it's just too much. I have to get over this. And he looked at me and he said, I hope you never do. And I'm almost crying.
That's the voice of Charles Hale, and we're speaking to him at McSorley's Old Ale House, and we're learning about his creative life and his new book, Untangling the Shadows. And I'm John Lee.
And I'm Martin Nutty. Welcome to a special episode in one of the fixtures of Irish America in New York City, here on Irish Stew.
This episode is sponsored by Shantella, your all-in-one business launchpad in the United States. Committed to excellence and execution, Shantella helps enterprises enter or expand in the U.S. market through bespoke project management and strategic planning solutions. Create and realize your vision with Shantella, where they invest their passion in your future success. To learn more, go to shantella.space. Yes, .space. It's a thing.
Hi, everybody. This is Martin Nutty, and welcome to another episode of the Irish Stew podcast. And we are recording in a unique situation, which I am going to let my co-host, John Lee, fill you all in on. So, John, tell us what we have coming up this go-round.
Well, we might have a couple of glasses of ale before the day is done, because in this episode, we're going to talk to Charles Hale, and we're going to try to see if by the end of the episode, we can figure out exactly what it is that Charles Hale does. He's organized salons in New York to create a place where artists can read, perform, display their work. He's curated concert series that blend classical, jazz, opera, tango, even magic. He's produced videos on family and history and performances, blending imagery, music, storytelling, on a lot of subjects, many of them related to the history of New York, including its musical history, jazz and the city, one of the programs. And now he's written a book, Untangling the Shadows, searching for the voices of my New York Irish ancestors, part memoir, part family history, a little bit of a detective story, history lesson, and at times maybe even a ghost story, something of a confessional too. And we're going to be talking to Charles Hale today in a location where he wrote, "There is no better place to start a New York City ancestral stroll than next to its pot-bellied coal stove," where he worked on the book, a spot you might rub elbows with ghosts from New York past while hoisting a brew at the bar of New York's oldest saloon, the venerable McSorley's Old Ale House, established in 1854, where one sign says, "We were here before you were born," and another warns, "Be good or be gone." Welcome, Charles R. Hale, to Irish Stew, on location at McSorley's.
Thank you, John. Actually, there's another story about 1854. 1854, the year John McSorley opened the saloon, my family arrived from Newry, Ireland, and they literally lived blocks away out on the Bowery. And I was in here one day, and Matty Marr, who was the owner, I said to him, I was with my son, and I said, Matty, my son Chris is probably the seventh generation of my family to come in here. What does that get me? And Matty said, "Oh, that'll get you a pat on the back." And so it's going back a few years. But thank you very much for having me here, John. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Great, excellent. Well, let me, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to introduce the other character we alluded to in this episode, our location, by way of the opening page of Joseph Mitchell's classic 1943 book, McSorley's Wonderful Saloon. The Old House at Home. McSorley's occupies the ground floor of a red brick tenement at 15 7th Street, just off Cooper Square, where the Bowery ends. It was opened in 1854, and it is the oldest saloon in New York City. In 88 years, it has 4 owners, an Irish immigrant, his son, a retired policeman, and his daughter. And all of them have been opposed to change. It is equipped with electricity, but the bar is stubbornly illuminated with a pair of gas lamps. which flicker fitfully and throw shadows on the low, cobwebby ceiling each time someone opens the street door. There is no cash register. Coins are dropped into soup bowls, one for nickels, one for dimes, one for quarters, one for halves, and bills are kept in a rosewood cash box. It's a drowsy place. The bartenders never make a needless move. The customers nurse their mugs of ale, and the 3 clocks on the wall have not been in agreement for many years. The clientele is motley. It includes mechanics from the many garages in the neighborhood, salesmen from the restaurant supply houses on Cooper Square, truck drivers from Wanamaker's, interns from Bellevue, students from Cooper Union, and clerks from the row of secondhand bookshops just north of Astor Place. The backbone of the clientele, however, is a rapidly thinning group of crusty old men, predominantly Irish, who have been drinking there since they were youths and now have a proprietary feeling towards the place. Some of them have tiny pensions and are all alone in the world. They sleep in Bowery hotels and spend practically all their waking hours in McSorley's. A few of these veterans clearly remember John McSorley, the founder, who died in 1910 at the age of 87. They refer to him as Old John, and they like to sit in their rickety armchairs around the big belly stove, which heats the place, gnaw on the stems of their pipe, and talk about him. Old John was quirky. And here we are. We're at exactly the table they're talking about, right by the pot-bellied stove.
So just to let our listeners know, you will hear some odd noises in the background as the bar opens up. I feel privileged to be sitting in here this morning, and thanks to the wonderful folks for enabling us to sit in McSorley's here and record. But Charles, I'm going to start off with a quote from your book. And so this will be a day probably of many quotes.
Okay.
And it appears, I believe, on page 266, and I'll read it. Over time, we ascribe meaning to the stories we've lived and learned. When we're young, we assemble our own personal narrative into a myth for how we should exist in the world. But sometimes these myths are filled with inconsistencies. Our myth may be outdated, inappropriate, and even worse, a misguiding force. Might I re-examine the stories and the myths that I am living and reconstruct my narrative? At times I have lived with the notion that my life has been a huge misdirection. So that's a pretty sobering quote. Did the writing of the book kind of recast your myth in some way?
I think it did, Martin. Going back, when I was growing up, I really had no particular direction. And yet, when I was in 9th grade, I began writing sports stories in junior high school. And I've got a lot of really good feedback from my teacher about that. And I thought, this is maybe a direction I should take because I love sports. I played sports. I read about sports. I love the history. And for a number of reasons, that kind of fell apart. Maybe I didn't get enough guidance or motivation. And shortly after that, some friends of mine said, you should be a sportscaster. You should be broadcasting the football games and so on and so forth. And I got referred to the teacher in school who ran the audiovisual and the announcing, and an appointment was set up, and for some reason I canceled it, and to this day I don't even know why. So I had a lot of those moments in my life where I think I should be doing this, I think I should be doing that, and I continually beat myself up. And I had this thing all my life about missed opportunities. I've always missed my opportunity. And then I began looking at my father's life. And I realized that a story I tell about my father, or many of the stories, are about his missed opportunities. And I said, wait a minute, there's something here. Am I living my father's unlived life? And I just began to become a little comfortable with the fact that this is the way it's been, this is the way it's gone. And I started opening myself up when I was about 50 years old to writing. I got back to it, and I started creating some shows and some movies, and I just began segueing out of that without putting lots of pressure on myself. And I think that was the thing that kept me back all those years. I just kept harping on that missed opportunity thing. And when I realized there was nothing I could do about it, it was the way it was, move forward, it just opened my eyes up. And as I wrote the book and I began comparing my missed opportunities to my father's, it just made it all clearer and clearer. And now it's just one of those things, to quote Cole Porter.
Yeah, it's kind of like the kind of pointlessness of arguing with one's past.
Exactly.
But probably more importantly, what I draw from your book is the importance of understanding one's past. And just kind of, your book gives a different window into a person's life in a way, simply because a lot of times we have people on the podcast and we say, talk to us about your origins. Well, you've kind of laid that out. And I believe one of your origins, actually all your origins you're more Irish than I am. I'm half English. But one of your origins actually comes out of Castleblaney and Monaghan. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a story behind that. And maybe you have a snippet from the book you can read or tell us about that.
Sure, I'd love to. Mm-hmm. Basically, the only person in the family for whom we knew where they were from was my mother's grandfather, George Gorman. Mm-hmm. And we knew he was from there. We knew he came here in the 1800s, and that was really all we knew. So somewhere along the line, we went back to Ireland about 30 years ago, and I determined to go to Castleblaney, where we knew he was from, to see what I could determine. As it turns out, I meet a man in town within an hour who's about 85 years old, who knew the history of the town. And I told him about the family, that they owned a butcher shop, and he said, I knew the family farm. I grew up on the farm next to it. Hop in the car, I'll take you out. So my family and I, my mother, my wife, my son, we get in the car, we drive out there. It's an old, rundown home. My mother walked inside, we walked around the property. And then finally I walked in, and my mother was standing there. And now I'll just read this from the book. I returned to the main room, which would have been used for cooking and eating, to find my mother standing in front of the fireplace. This is where they would sit and eat every night, she said. She stood still, quietly staring, imagining a scene scripted over a century ago. Although she didn't express it as such, it felt to me as if my mother were on a pilgrimage and was, at last, standing in front of a family shrine. There are times when the expressiveness of silence is more powerful than words. This was one of those moments. I felt her emotions gather. It's the first time I've ever felt my father was connected to something, she said. All we knew was that when he was a child, he lived a miserable existence on the streets of New York City. But it was as if nothing or no one came before his childhood, my mother said, reminding me of her response when she learned that her father, Alexander, was named after his grandfather. I don't know why I feel better, but I do. And it's the first time I've ever felt warmth for my grandfather, George. No one ever had anything nice to say about him, but now his reason for coming to America doesn't seem so important. I just feel better knowing there really is a link, a connection between my father, my grandfather, and Ireland. After a few minutes, Jackie Byrne said, let's be on with it. Let's not overstay our welcome. We took some photos and left the farm. We drove Jackie home, thanked him for all he'd done, and returned to Dublin in silence. But in that moment, in my mother's silence, I knew that the story had changed forever. It was no longer about George's reason for leaving Ireland. The story had become our need, the human need for connection.
Charles, maybe you could, just a little parenthetical note there, maybe you could mention why the Jack, was
Jackie.
Jackie was anxious to keep moving out of that farm.
Well, the police. Now, and what I learned later on was that area was a bit of a hotbed for the IRA. and there were bombings that happened years earlier. So everybody was very conscious of showing up on somebody's property, walking around.
Yeah.
Who are they?
Right.
And but he was very kind of him to take us there. But all of a sudden, it's okay, let's go, and we left.
This is the point where you talk about the butcher shop story.
Yes.
That comes up a lot, and like, why is and the theme of why it was important and why its importance faded.
Well, I think it was important because we always told the story about what a tough guy he was. The story was he was in the family's butcher shop and the police came in and maybe he was involved in some of the troubles that were going on at the time with land agitation. And all of a sudden he left. And the story became he was a really tough guy. He didn't take any bullshit. He came to America and we moved forward from there. And I think what happened, the reason the story changed is we no longer needed it. The family was 2 or 3 generations on. Everybody was doing pretty well. That story didn't work anymore. We don't have to tell the story of we're tough guys and we are going to overcome and we are going to succeed. And then I think as I looked at my mother searching for connection and me searching for connection, I realized that's where the story changed to. That's what it changed to, the search for connection. And that's so much what this book is about, my connecting to my past. Just to add, one of the people who commented on the back of the book was my master's advisor. And this is like 30, 35 years ago, where she said to me, you should write a book on the impact that your family has had on who you've become. And that's kind of what I did. Then I went back. She had written a number of books, and I looked inside the book, and she inscribed that in the book. She's now living in Rome. I sent her a note. I said, Verbena, you wrote this. Here's the book.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
Oh, man, you must have made her day, week,
she
month.
wrote me a beautiful note. Yeah. This is part of what she wrote here. A must for anyone interested in history, family, and the thrill of searching through archives, graveyards, and one's own heart for the gentle shades of those loved and lost. So I read this to our friend Peter Quinn, and he said, geez, I wish I had written that. I said, well,
still time.
You're pretty good. But that was a very sweet.
Yeah.
And she is an amazing woman because it was only a short period of time that I spoke with her that she came up with this idea. Yeah. And I said, boy, talk about intuitive, how someone can sit down for a little bit and say, hey, here's what you should. So I said, it took me 30, 35 years, but here we go.
A long gestation.
Yeah.
So I think you and I, Charles, share the same odd habit of being comfortable trolling through archives and wandering through graveyards and visiting places where our ancestors walked before so we can breathe the air. I have a very simple and straightforward question that many Irish people in Ireland are, let's say, bemused by their hyphenated American cousins, Irish American cousins, to visit them. And they would say something to the effect, well, you were born in America, you are American, why bother with all this? So why bother? Why the need for this connection? Isn't it good enough to be American?
I don't think it was ever about the connection to Ireland. Because growing up, we had no idea, I had no idea where my family was from other than one great-grandfather. And when I'd ask, my father would say they were from England, and my mother would say they're from Denmark and Germany and all different places. So there was no sense of connection at all. And I just started looking back, basically because Verbena and people were suggesting this might be helpful for you to get an understanding of your past. And when I went to Ireland for the first time, we were in Kinsale. In fact, I was just there 2 weeks ago. And we were in a pub. And I was with my wife, and these two fellas, one plays the guitar and one the mandolin, started singing a song, A Town I Love So Well by Phil Coulter. And it was at that point, I was probably in my 40s, where I realized I've never felt a connection to Ireland at all. And it was the first moment that I did. So I still think it's less, people say, why do you go to Ireland a lot? You're so connected to Ireland. And I think it's more, I like going there. I just enjoy it.
Yeah.
I like the conviviality. I like the fact that I can speak the language.
Yeah.
I like places like this.
Yeah.
And so it's more, I think, about I just enjoy it, and it so happens I'm connected to that. So I don't know. Does that answer?
There is a kinship that comes out, right? There's a feeling of kinship.
People say tribe.
I'm the other.
Right.
Our situations are so dissimilar. Like you mentioned, you were brought up Catholic, not Irish.
Right.
That's a theme that's come up several times. We had our mystery writer, Jack Byrne from Liverpool, who big Irish community, but they were Catholic, not Irish. The Irish part was a later discovery.
Right.
Still, there is something that draws me back there as opposed to another country. There's a feeling of kinship. And I do think, like Martin brought out, it's sort of hard for Irish people to understand what it's all about.
And a lot of Americans go there, and you're right, I hear that all the time. It's like, what's with this?
Yeah.
What's with this coming back, walking through cemeteries? I love walking through Calvary, for instance, which was really the Irish cemetery, I guess, back in the late 18th, I think it opened in 1848. It's just marvelous. And when I found my family, the Hale, the first Hale was buried there, and there's no marker. That was pretty compelling, standing on top of the spot where my first American ancestor that I know of was buried, and looking at the rolling hills and feeling connected. How did his son feel when he came? Did it remind him of Ireland? It was, Calvary is still rolling, and where they were from, there were a lot of rolling hills. So I always wonder about these connections. I have to tell you one story. I thought of this last night. This is before I even started doing any of this. And I was driving with my wife on the Taconic Parkway one Sunday, and we were up in the country, and we were going through the section that had rolling hills. And I looked to the left, and there was this rolling mound, maybe 3 or 4 of them. And I was driving, but I kept looking off to the left, and I kept staring, and I kept saying to myself, there's something about this. I don't know what this is. Then, 10 years later, we go to Castle Laney, and there are these drumlins, these rolling hills. And so I am not religious at all, and I don't know what that was about. But boy, that was a moment that I just got goosebumps telling that story here. Anyway, so...
Yeah, there's probably some genetic connection. And at this point, I will explain to John what the meaning of drumlins are. They are
no, Martin. I'm up on
Let
drumlins.
me have my moment here.
Talk to the listeners.
You guys want to...
Too light?
I'll do it too dark, please.
Light.
Just to tell our audience, we are moving more solidly into the McSorley's experience. Light and dark ale is all they serve, and we're going to have a sample of all. So back to the drumlins.
Okay.
So John apparently is well educated in drumlin geology, and they are the residue of the Ice Age, which retreated from Ireland around 12,000 years ago.
Well, that's more than I know.
So
I grew up on a drumlin in Connecticut.
I am disturbed by that confluence of fact.
Really.
But what I also think is and as a writer, you probably appreciate that, of course, the greatest writer to emerge out of Monaghan was a guy called Paddy Kavanagh. His poem, and his favorite poem, or probably his best known poem, at least for me in school, was Stony Grey Soil of Monaghan. So there's probably a reason why your ancestor left, because it ain't good soil there, and drumlins ain't good. But I can see how the rolling foothills would be of interest. But just flipping back to your story in your book, and as our lovely beers are
that's a beautiful
up.
sound. That's a beautiful sound.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
The book strikes me as being, in many ways, a story of your 2 grandfathers. So tell us
To
about
Charles' grandfather, Sláinte.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much, fellas.
the extraordinarily sad story that the book opens up with is your grandfather, Ali Gorman, and him and his wife, and losing a daughter right immediately after childbirth. So can you give us a little bit about his backstory? Because he's a huge figure in your life. He took you to baseball games and drove a nice car, but he also had some scars.
Well, it's funny. You're just mentioning that story gives me that lump in my throat. And I have to catch myself because still, when I talk about particularly Allie Gorman, it brings me to tears. And he died in 1969, so he's been gone a long time. He had such a horrible childhood. He was born in Manhattan, and then they moved when he was 4 or 5 years old to Brooklyn. His mother died of tuberculosis when he was 4. He was in a horrible fire with his brother when he was 6 and his brother was 4, and his brother was killed in the fire. His father was alcoholic. My grandfather ended up in a reform school. Apparently, I found the record that he was arrested for assaulting a night watchman while stealing wood. And I would imagine that his father told him, Allie, go out and get some wood. And from what my mother said, he lived on the street a lot. He had just a horrible childhood. But then when he got out he went to the Protectory, the reform school and orphanage up in the Bronx. And then when he got out, he went into the Merchant Marine. And he seemed to turn around his life. He married my grandmother. He had 5 daughters, one of which died early on. And he became a labor leader. But more than anything, and I've had discussions with my cousins about this because my one male cousin, who was the same age as me, had a very different feeling about my grandfather. And for some reason, he was very connected to me because I think maybe my mother was the youngest and they liked my mother the most. And I was athletic and he was athletic. He seemed to be there whenever you needed anything. I mean, this gives me the catch again. He'd show up. And despite anything that happened in his life or any difficulty, he was there. And every once in a while, I had a lunch with a psychologist friend of mine years ago, and I said, Jesus, this is terrible. Every time I talk about my grandfather, I lose it. I can't take it. I mean, it's just too much. I have to get over this. And he looked at me and he said, I hope you never do. Oh, wow. And that makes me almost cry saying that. He said that, it's like you're digging deep down to that intense love in your heart, and there's nothing better, So I was blessed having him. My mother said to me one day when they gave out grandfathers, you must have been in the front of the line because you had 2, they were both labor leaders, as it turns out, one in the fire department, one as a Teamster. And they were a big part of my life. And I spent a lot of time, as you could see reading the book, researching and finding out little details and interviewing people.
That's what I wanted to ask you about exactly. You talk about connections. You had a lot of work to do to make those connections, besides the emotional connections, just ferreting out all the connections that add up to this story. You were in archives, you were examining photos, you were looking for news clippings, you were finding your clues from everywhere. I mean, it's an amazing piece of detective work. And then, you would admittedly take a leap of imagination from time to time and just sort of say, was it like this? Did it happen this way?
Right.
Incredible detective work.
Thank you, John. You're right. I spent a lot of time. One day, about a year ago, I went through my notes because I'd go down to Chambers Street to the Municipal Archives quite a bit. And I had pages and pages. And I'd be looking for a death certificate. And I might go through 100 pages of microfilm on the machine. And I looked at that and I said, how the hell did I do that? God, it was over and over and over. And these little pieces of information that might mean nothing, but you have to write it down because one day maybe you'll connect it together. And then I was meeting people. I met people along the way, a couple who knew my firefighter grandfather. And they were just really eye-opening, fun stories. Hearing my grandfather always walked around the fire department. I heard this from a fireman who knew him when he was young with a stethoscope. I said, a stethoscope? He said, your grandfather was very involved with firemen's rights and disability, and he'd go to the hospital a lot. So he'd put on a jacket and a stethoscope, and he'd walk around. He was Dr. Hale. And my grandfather always walked around like he owned everything anyway. So when he walked in, he must own the hospital. I don't know. We'll let him walk around. So I was learning all of those things. And it kind of filled in because I had this sense that he was bigger than life. And my father used to say that. I use that phrase. And then as I learned these things about him, it filled in. Oh, that's what he did, or that's why people thought that. Anyway, so I was very fortunate, very, very fortunate. I think I calculated the grandparents or fathers are 27% of the book.
Yeah.
Because they were that important to me.
I think, and speaking about your other grandfather, Charles Hale, who you just remembered and is your namesake, is an interesting story about him getting an award for a event that took place actually quite near here. So you want to tell us a little bit about that and how that played out?
Yeah, there was, we knew a bit of the story growing up that my grandfather tried to save this man and almost put himself in a very precarious situation. And my grandmother wanted to divorce him. What are you, crazy? You've got a 9-year-old and a 4-year-old kid, and you're doing all this stuff. The story was, this is July of 1936, and he's standing outside the firehouse, 4:30, 5 o'clock, getting ready to go off. And he looks up across the street, and this guy is hanging off a ledge 4 or 5 stories up. He grabs another fireman. They run down the street to Fifth Avenue. This is on 18th Street. They run to Fifth Avenue. They run up the stairs. My grandfather gets on a ledge. The other fireman is holding his ankles, and he pulls the guy in. And he got an award at City Hall for that. An interesting side note is I'm sitting in here one day with a friend of mine, Joe McElligott, who I think you know. And I said to him, this is first when he and I met, I said, Joe, that's a McElligott's a famous name in the fire department. He said, yeah, John Jay was my grandfather's brother. So I said, let me go do a little research. I go home and I find out that John J. McElligott and Fiorello LaGuardia gave my grandfather the medal at City Hall. So you talk about connection.
Oh, wow. that must have sent a little chill.
That really, it's like, whoa, what a moment. So that was an interesting...
And this grandfather is Charles Hale in the fire department. He was a larger-than-life figure, but sadly, his life came to a difficult end. He was injured in a accident at work, and then the injury was compounded by, I believe, myeloma. And you talk very poignantly about his end and you and your father going to visit him. So tell us a little bit more about that story, because I think sometimes when we think of family members, we think of their starts and we think of their ends, and I think we invest in that some kind of special meaning.
Would you like me to read a little bit about it?
Yeah, if you could.
Perfect, thank you.
Wonderful.
So this section is called Last Visit. My father and I leave our apartment on Little Neck Parkway in Glen Oaks, Queens, about 10 o'clock, an hour before we'd normally leave for a Giants game at Yankee Stadium. We plan to visit my grandfather, Charlie, at Lenox Hill Hospital in Manhattan. We enter Manhattan through the Midtown Tunnel and turn right onto 3rd Avenue. We drive north through the lassitude that embraces Manhattan on a bleak Sunday morning and make a left onto 77th Street. My father parks the car. Wait here, son. They don't allow children in your grandfather's room. Something's wrong. I can sense my father's unease, the tension in his body and in his voice. Waiting for my father to return to the car, I gaze up to the 2nd floor. A man in a white coat appears and turns a wheelchair toward the window. A shriveled man, aged far beyond his 57 years, presses his drawn visage against the glass, foreshadowing a 13-year-old's first encounter with death. I know now why my father doesn't want me to see my grandfather. His withered body, battered by a life-threatening injury sustained during his last fire and ravaged by the onset of multiple myeloma, makes him almost unrecognizable. I see his mouth moving, but the glass and the distance mute his words. I continue waving as the man in the white coat wheels my helpless grandfather away from the window. But sitting by myself in the car, I understand. I know, Grandpa, I say to myself. This is goodbye. My father returns a few moments later, and we drive to the stadium in silence. I don't remember much about the game, but I do remember the lights reflecting off the players' blue helmets. I remember the smell of cigars, and I remember the sky, hues of gray meeting the distant buildings, forming the horizon, and I remember my father's silence. A month later, my mother called me into her bedroom. Grandpa Charlie was gone. I fell onto her bed and cried and cried. I didn't understand how someone so full of life could be gone. Now, all these years later, I stare at the painting of the fireman playing cards, and I laugh when I hear the words King Kong. I think of the cigar hanging from his mouth, his booming laugh, and its physical presence. But more than anything, I remember his stories. Bigger than life, right, Dad? Yes, Charles. Bigger than life.
Charles, we're I think another word I'd use when I think about what you've written here is unflinching. You're probing, you're touching nerves, and I'm not sure I'd ever have the kind of courage to do that. So we just thanks for sharing this. Let's just take a moment to remember where we are here, right by the pot-bellied stove in McSorley's old ale house. A place where I personally have had quite a few adventures. There was a time my life might have changed quite dramatically because I almost had an apartment upstairs from McSorley's. And I can see the arc of my life changing if that had happened. And then Martin and I have been here a few times, since the Irish Stew era. We met with our Irish Stew guest, Damien Shields here, who, it's his favorite place in America, practically. That's not a cemetery. So, we're happy to bring you back here. We're sorry to put you through all the paces, but I'm about to put you through another section here because I want to just kind of skip ahead. And it's going to get into some of the ways about the time where I started to know you and some of the other creative work you did. But we're going to jump ahead to the epilogue where you noted your two acts in your personal drama. Act 1, 40 years in the financial services industry. Act 2, writer, producer, musical theater director. An outstanding leap into the unknown. When you were deep into Act 1, did you have any sense of Act 2?
The answer to that is clearly no. I had no idea. I mean, I didn't beat myself up anymore. We talked about that, and I'd gotten past that. But I still had in the back of my mind, what would I like to do? And I kept a journal. Actually, I used to sit here with a little black journal, and I'd write notes and just put things down and see what would happen. And all of a sudden, I was about 50, and I had a few really big, successful years. And my wife was very successful. And at that point, really didn't have to work as much as I had in the past. And I just started writing more, and coincidentally, there was a magazine out called New York Stories, and they said, we're looking for stories in the theme of Joseph Mitchell type stories. And,
man we started with.
Yeah, exactly. And so I had written a story about my grandfather in the fire department, and I sent it, and they published it. And that was the first thing I ever had published. But it was at that moment I began to think, maybe I should write more. Mm-hmm. And then music was so important to me from the time I was very, very young. And my mother never had the TV on. It was always music. And I was pretty much the same way growing up. And then I began thinking one day, I was at the Irish Repertory Theater. And it was Dancing at Lunasa, Brian Friel's play. Aideen Maloney and people we know are in it. Yeah. And at the end, Kieran O'Reilly is the moderator, and he gets up and he says, when I cast my mind back to that magical summer of, and I was sitting there with a friend, and I said to her, I can do this. And she said, you can do what? I said, I can create music, and I can... And she looked at me like I'd lost my mind because I'd never said anything like this. I went home that night and created a little video about my street sweeper great-great-grandfather, John Coakley, and I knew nothing about creating videos.
The White Wings.
White Wings.
Yeah,
I sent it to Peter Quinn, and he still says to me, that was the best one you made.
It was excellent.
Yeah, I made 30 or 40, I made many of these.
You're getting into something which I think I met you about 15 years ago.
Yeah.
On the board of the Irish American Writers and Artists. I think that was relatively early in your voyage.
Yes.
On Act Two. I may have come in a few scenes late, but I was there fairly early. What you do is not what other people have done. You're putting things together. You're part of it, I think, is a kind of a curation of ideas and people. But even your book, I've never read a book structured the way your book is structured. I've never, those concerts at the Self Theater, the way you were mixing in the elements and the way you would have you would narrate and then there would be video and then there would be a live singer. It's not like revolutionary, like when Jackson Pollock first showed up with his painting, but I've never seen it before. I've never seen the way you approach these things before.
I guess it really came down to just the way that I could best express myself. It was just combining all of these interests in New York City history, interested in my family history, music, theater. And I would just sit there and it would come to me.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to write this, but, behind me should be this picture or this radio broadcast or something like that. So it was really just taking all of the stuff I learned over time and putting it together in a way that worked for me and hopefully appealed to an audience.
Right.
And I would hear that a lot. Well, this is really different.
I think going back to the notion of shadows and ghosts, one of the interesting stories in your background and in your book is the shadow and ghost of Ebbets Field and the meaning within your family. So for New Yorkers, most of us of a certain age would obviously be familiar with Ebbets Field, but maybe for some of our other listeners, they're not. So talk to me about Ebbets Field and like you're explaining to somebody that had never heard of or seen it and what it meant to your family. There's a very poignant picture of your father and grandfather sitting, looking at a game through a little narrow kind of almost aperture at the field. So tell us a bit about that photo. Okay. Tell us a bit about Ebbets Field.
Well, Ebbets Field is where the Brooklyn Dodgers played.
The Bums,
the National League baseball team. They played there from the early 1900s through 1957. And when I was a very little boy, my grandfather and father would take me on occasion. And I have this vivid memory, and many men I speak to have this, going to a baseball game with their father for the first time and walking in and seeing the greenest green imaginable.
It's true.
Because if you grew up in New York City, you didn't see green.
Even growing up in Connecticut, the first time I went into Yankee Stadium.
Amazing. Right? It's just a beautiful green. So the photo you refer to, my father and grandfather, I had seen that photo of them sitting. It was obviously at a baseball game. And that's all I knew about that. And I began to research this. And I had a feeling it was probably Ebbets Field because they lived in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. And if you lived in Brooklyn, you were a Brooklyn Dodger fan. And they would go to a game. Mm-hmm. So I began researching and I found, I typed in different magazines. And there was a magazine called PIC, P-I-C, that catered more to young boys, entertainment, sports, lurid stories, so on and so on. And I found that the New York Historical Society had copies of PIC magazine. And I went there and I looked at the photo and I figured my father was about 13 years old at the time. So I go back to 1940 and I go look and there it is in July issue of 1940. And the date is May 31st, 1940. My grandfather took my father there for my father's 13th birthday. Oh my God. And it was a doubleheader. I learned everything about it. Bob Feller pitched a
No, really?
One hitter.
Oh, gosh.
But one of the things that was really interesting and really was a big clue was I'm looking at the umpires, and one of the umpires has white pants on. And it's white pants, and I type it in online, and they wore white pants on holidays. My father's birthday was Memorial Day.
You could have been a detective. You could have been a detective.
Yeah, I think Malachi Brown might have had some use for Charles.
Absolutely.
Another of our guests who, along actually a couple of our guests, right? We had Mark Little and Malachi Brown. They had a company called Storyful, and that was actually charged with investigating photos that would pop up on Twitter and validating them. So
Pulitzer Prize.
So obviously you're doing that with a much older photo. And what's also interesting, of course, about that photo is you don't see out of their faces. It's just their backs.
Just their backs.
And there's something kind of very poignant about that, about a father and his son.
And an arm.
The
arm around the shoulder.
That really caught me.
Yeah.
You know, and if you take that arm away, one of the clues to that also was that sweater my father was wearing in that lasted while I was a kid. I remember it because if you look closely at that, you can see a little marking where the shoulder, his arm around my father, and it was his name, Charles, written across the back. It was a green sweater, and my grandmother had knitted in his name across the back.
Your grandfather, Charles, was this larger-than-life figure, and it had to be difficult for his son. And one of the things that comes out in the book is, let's say, the difficulties in your own upbringing with your father. And he went into some fairly black moods at times, and he was difficult to be around. What out of that do you take? Is it about being overshadowed by his grandfather, or maybe he was a war veteran and had to go off to war and he had aspirations to be a Brooklyn Dodger, and he missed out on that opportunity? How much is missed opportunity? How much is shadow? Or have you ever able to untease that?
My take on that, like I've had people say to me, because my father was very moody, was maybe he was bipolar. I don't think he was bipolar. My grandmother doted on him. And my grandfather, Charlie, in the fire department, was away a lot. He was very involved in the fire department. He was very involved in politics. In addition to that, my grandmother's mother lived in the house. And apparently, according to my mother, she would go around casting aspersions. And my father was her main target. So my father, the day he turned 17, he left for the Navy. What I also learned, and this is the first time I'm saying this aloud, is that my mother told me that my father said to her before he died that his father would smack him around.
Oh, gosh.
So, you know, how long did that go on? What was really happening? That stuff I'll never know. But I look at my father. If you were with him when he was up, which was often, if he were in here, he'd be everybody would love him. Yeah. Funny, good looking, women liked him, men loved him. It was great. And then he'd have days, and I wrote it in here, where he would say nothing. And my business partner said to me one day, "What do you mean nothing?" I said, "What don't you understand?" Nothing. Maybe he'd grunt. And so as kids, we began to understand those moods and how to work around them. So I don't know if I ever really quite figured out what it was, but I do think it was pretty much a result of his upbringing. I think my grandmother was probably the daughter of alcoholics, very much in denial of every emotion. Don't feel that way, don't feel this way, don't feel that way. And when she would talk to my father, you couldn't be in the same room with them. She would say, "Charles, are you okay? Do you need something?" And my father, you'd see him, he would just tighten up and cringe. It was horrible. And he was in the hospital. I think I have it in here. And he had a hypertensive attack, and he had gone out with my grandmother for dinner the night before. And we're in the hospital. And I start talking to him. I said, "Dad, somehow you're going to have to come to terms with dealing with your mother." And he starts talking about her. And he's on a heart monitor. And the monitor starts ringing, and the nurse runs in. She said, "What's going on here?" I said, "He's talking about his mother."
Oh, God.
He's talking about his mother. Yeah, it's a long story. Don't worry about it.
No, I got you.
But you could see the impact. So all of this stuff, to me, was what was going on. And it manifested itself in the way he acted oftentimes around his family. Not his friends, and not in a place like this, but his family. And it was hard. And I love my father. He'd do anything for his children. I feel bad. I think back.
You say in a place like this, we were in relative seclusion here in McSorley's. There were about six people here and then about 50 people just walked in. And they're tourists. They're looking around. They had a good time seeing the sights and sounds. But as long as we're in McSorley's, let's take advantage of the opportunity.
Okay.
What grabs you about the place? What are some of the, I love the fact that, today they have the special on 2 mugs for $8. I think there's only 2 days a year that the special doesn't occur, St. Patrick's Day and their birthday. But what are some of the things here that,
Well, all right,
you
John,
spent
here we
time
go. I'm
here
going to tell you a little
writing.
bit of a secret.
Okay, great.
I have a picture on the wall. There's a picture of me on the wall.
Oh, I am now bowing to Charles Hale.
So if you go into the back room, I was here with a bunch of people one day, and Peter McDermott from the Irish Echo was here and took a picture of us, and he put it in the Irish Echo, and Maddie Marr saw it, and they put it up on the wall over there, and Maddie said, if you can get this made into a picture, we'll put it up.
Oh, fantastic.
Right? Oh, and that picture is up in the back room.
We're going to go see that.
I'll have to take a look.
And I knew Maddie, I came here a lot, and I knew Maddie from the racetrack. When I worked in racing, Maddie had some horses, and he came out. And we always have this memory. Every time Maddie walked in, he would put his hand by the stove, make sure by the pot-bellied stove, yeah.
But look at the history. I mean, you see pictures of Theodore Roosevelt, Brent Terfel, the opera singer, Frank McCourt, some of the old-time bartenders, some of the paintings by, this is Teresa. Teresa is the daughter of Maddie, who's now the owner, and her husband, Gregory de la Habe, is an artist.
This used to be a place that didn't allow women to come in. Now there's a woman behind the bar and owns the place.
Owns the joint, as my grandfather would say.
Enough changes. It looks like the right things change here.
No. It's the stove, sitting behind the stove. I mean, I don't know how many times I've come in and just sat there, and it's so salubrious, I guess would be a good word for it. And just have an ale and maybe take some notes. Yeah. And the nicest time to be in here, in my opinion, is like a Tuesday afternoon in the winter with a little snow coming down.
With the light raking in. I'm with you. Like maybe Friday night, that's
a little busy on Friday nights,
busy,
right?
Very busy.
And so much. Look at the bar, how great the bar is.
Yeah.
And the sandwiches. Where are you going to get a $6 sandwich in New York City?
We'll be there later.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Why don't we wrap it up? You end in a very interesting way. It's a book of prose. It's a book of research. It's a book of emotions. But towards the end, we hear a poem. Let's end up with that, and then we'll hear your shameless plug.
Okay. So basically, every line in this short poem comes from a story. And I had written this out in paragraph form, and then one day it came to me, I can write a poem out of this, and that's what I've done. So it really answers the question, who am I, which is so much of what this book is about. I am the river flowing beneath the Brooklyn Bridge. I am the city rising against the bay and the sky, an immigrant dressed in rags. I am a wave on the Pacific, the son of a sailor, a tangle of shadows. I am a descendant of the nameless, the expressiveness of silence. I am the rolling hills of Ireland. I am buildings gone to dust, an empty space. I am a man's broken body, his grieving widow. I am a baby scorned and forgotten, her weeping mother, a name etched in stone. I am a splash of light, twilight's lengthening shadows. I am smoke hanging on a breeze. I am an endless field of green, a patchwork quilt. I am the sweep of a hill. I am a grandfather in a turnover coat, a grandfather in a cauldron of steam. I am their wisdom and courage. I am a boy sliding home, shadows in the grass, friends gone to war. I am a white wing, a street sweeper, a photograph, an ancestor. I am a boy leaving home, a digger of tunnels. I am an old man dressed in tweed. I am my father's laugh, my mother's guidance, my grandfather's wisdom. I am everyone. I am an accumulation of yesterdays, a rich dream of memories. I am the keeper of the tales. I am a storyteller.
That'd be lovely. Charles, Say hello to the latest person at the table here, Seamus Plug. He wanted to ask you a question. He doesn't speak for himself, but he wanted to ask you, what would you like to plug? What should we know about you? Where should the listeners find out more?
Well, they can go to my Facebook page. I'm very active on Facebook. I actually have a New York City group there that I post about anything about New York that moves me. It's history, photographs, music, sports, etc. And right now, I'm in discussion with David Goldman, who's been the music director of some of my shows, and a few other people about creating a new show. And we don't have a name for it yet, but it'll be something to do with American voices. Not only immigrants, Native Americans, refugees. And we hope to have that in some New York City venues in the fall. We have 3 places in mind. So that's something hopefully people can keep an eye out for. And so there's my shameless plug.
Perfect.
Thank you, John and Martin. I appreciate it.
And so with that, we want to thank Charles Hale for joining us. And we recommend for those that have love of stories from the past, his book, Untangling the Shadows. It's a great read. Certainly was right up my alley. And it's been a memorable hour here in McSorley's, and we want to thank the lovely folks here.
Possibly the most enjoyable.
So with that, we're going to raise a glass and clink and draw this episode to a close.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you.
John, I've always got time to talk to people like Charles Hale, especially in, let's say, a slightly different setting than we normally record. A little dark ale is always a pleasure. I know you're more an aficionado of McSorley's light ale. As our listeners no doubt know, I am a history nerd. I'm also a genealogical nerd. So Charles was ticking all those boxes for me. And I think why that's important to him and why that's important to me is because all of us look for some kind of deeper connection with a place. And what roots one most firmly is understanding maybe where a couple of generations back came from. So you really understand some of the odd things that might crop up in your family in unexpected ways. And Charles obviously lays that out really well in this book.
You know, I've known Charles for maybe a dozen years, and he's somebody who came to the creative life relatively late in life. And as I mentioned at one point, trying to describe exactly what he does is a little bit difficult because he's doing things that are different. And by that, I don't mean he's a revolutionary. His work doesn't feel revolutionary. It feels original. And the book is just one aspect of what Charles Hales is up to. And he cleared the way for us to record at McSorley's. An episode of McSorley's was worth the price of admission to me. And we did have a few libations along the way, but I'd be happy to say that the people at McSorley's did not have to invoke the be good or be gone clause.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.